In this video, I share inmate stories from Mid-State Correctional Facility, home of the infamous Day of Terror. These accounts are taken from Judge Brindisi's December 2nd, 2024 opinion, where he states the claimants have proven their civil claim of excessive force by a preponderance of the credible evidence. July 6, 2016 will remain solidified as Mid-State Correctional Facility's Day of Terror. These are some of the inmate stories.
Pablo Dones claimant, Pablo Dones testified that he was housed in one of the four-man rooms in the 4H dorm at the time of the July 6th incident. He shared the room with Frank Gillard, Jeremiah Williams, and Tony King. During the raid, Mr. Dones stated that Officer O'Neill grabbed the back of his head and slammed it into the wall, causing a hole in the wall. He mentioned that he had never seen the officers go as crazy as they did that day, and he was frightened. He also described an earlier incident involving Officer Cole on July 3rd. At that time, staff questioned him about who assaulted the officer, but he responded that the officer had not been assaulted. Instead, he had fallen and hit his head. On July 6, Mr. Downs heard the dorm door bang open and had officers ordering the incarcerated individuals to return to their rooms while using racial slurs. The officers instructed everyone to lie on the floor with their hands on their heads. Mr. Downs testified that he then heard officers enter a room opposite his own and heard RB screaming. The officers were pushing something into Mr. RB's rear. Mr. Downs recognized Mr. RB's voice because they often played dominoes and talked together. He heard Mr. RB shout, "Why are you sticking that in my backside?" And he was screaming it repeatedly. After hearing Mr. RB's voice, two officers entered Mr. Downs' room. Mr. Downs testified that he saw Tony King get kicked in the face and witnessed Frank Gillard get kicked in the shoulder. When Mr. Downs stood up, the officers grabbed him and slammed his head into the wall. Before he stood up, they had kicked him on his right side near the groin area where he had recently undergone hernia surgery. Officer O'Neill slammed his head into the wall 3 times. Afterward, Mr. Downs was told to pick up his mattress and take it to the magnetometer. The officers also escorted him to the bathroom to provide a urine sample. He further testified that most of the officers had their name tags covered. Mr. Downs testified that all the brass was in 4H that day, and specifically that the warden walked through the housing unit and witnessed what had happened. Mr. Downs said he put in about 3 property claim forms regarding any alleged property damage, but he never got an answer. During cross-examination, Mr. Downs testified that he filled out an injury report dated August 11th, 2016, in which he mentioned receiving a kick in the groin. Mr. Downs further testified that as he was walked into and back out of the bathroom by an officer to provide urine, he saw and heard JD being punched and kicked by another officer in a bathroom stall. Mr. JD was positioned by the side of the stall wall and was attempting to urinate, repeatedly telling the officer that he could not do so. Mr. Downs testified that Mr. JD was crying out in pain and said, "I can't piss, and you kicking me and hitting me is not going to get me to piss." Mr. Downs witnessed the officer strike Mr. JD approximately 3 times. Portions of Mr. Downs' testimony was corroborated by claimant Jeremiah Williams, who testified that he observed an officer throw Mr. Downs headfirst into a wall, causing a hole in the wall, and by NF, who also testified that he saw Mr. Downs being thrown into a wall. No clear evidence was presented during the trial to show that Mr. Downs had exhausted the available administrative remedies concerning his allegedly damaged or destroyed property.
Ezequiel Martinez, claimant. Ezequiel Martinez testified that during the raid, several COs threw him to the ground, beat him, and destroyed all of his belongings. Mr. Martinez stated that he was punched in the back of the head, kicked in the ribs, and struck in the side with a stick. He claimed that he was on the floor for half an hour and never saw who assaulted him. In his testimony, Mr. Martinez testified that the officers were breaking everything in his room, including property and food, while throwing objects across the room. He relayed how terrified he was, noting that he was shaking and afraid of being beaten up for no reason. When asked if he could see the officers responsible, Mr. Martinez testified that he was unable to because he was lying on the floor with his head down, fearing that if he looked up, he would be beaten more severely. He kept his face down out of fear, not wanting to provoke further violence. Following the raid, he testified that everything in the day room was destroyed. The TV was broken, the phone was damaged, and items were trashed and scattered everywhere. He did not file a property damage claim as it relates to the incident on July 6, 2016. In this portion of his testimony, Mr. Martinez confirmed the accuracy of a written statement he signed. The statement details an incident on July 6, 2016, in the 4H housing unit, where officers assaulted him and others. Mr. Martinez describes being kicked in the ribs and threatened with death if he reported the assault. He was warned that if he spoke out, the officers would return, assault him again, and ensure he wouldn't go home. Mr. Martinez confirms the statement is true and testified that he was scared for his life and just wanted the threats and assaults to stop.
Cole Bryant. In his testimony, claimant Cole Bryant describes a violent and chaotic search conducted by officers in the 4H dorm. Upon entering the room, the officers ordered everyone to lie face down on the floor. After complying with the order to unlock his locker, Mr. Bryant witnessed the officers trashing the room, kicking over beds, throwing lockers, and pouring food over his legal paperwork. Mr. Bryant testified that an officer then stomped on his head, forcing him to keep his face down. Mr. Bryant testified that officers kicked him in the ribs, stomped on his head and back, and destroyed his legal papers. Additionally, Mr. Bryant testified that he heard racial slurs, including the term cock-sucking niggers. Mr. Bryant testified hearing an officer tell another person, R, "This is what it feels like to be helpless," while he listened to sounds of kicks and punches. After being ordered to take his mattress out into the hallway, Mr. Bryant testified he noticed R still lying face down on the floor. Mr. Bryant testified later on, after giving urine and while waiting on the bench in the day room, he saw the superintendent come to the door of the housing unit. He observed the superintendent observing what was happening inside, speaking with one of the officers, and then leaving. He also stated that staff threatened them against seeking medical attention, warning of consequences if they did. Mr. Bryant testified that he did not appeal the denial of his property claim.
Ricardo Moore. Claimant Ricardo Moore testified that his initial placement at Mid-State CF was in the Veterans Dorm, a special unit for individuals with verified DD-214 forms, organized with military-style structure. He stayed in this dorm for a brief period but was removed after allegedly witnessing a sexual assault by an officer on an incarcerated individual. Mr. Moore testified that after being removed from the Veterans Dorm, he was placed in the 4H dorm around November 2015. His title from the Veterans Dorm, where he had served as an echelon supervisor, carried over. Mr. Moore testified he was appointed as the chairperson of the Inmate Liaison Committee, ILC, which is mandated by DOCCS rules and present in every facility. Mr. Moore confirmed that he was familiar with the senior staff, brass, at Mid-State CF, including Sergeant O'Neill and Lieutenant Hebel, and stated that he would still recognize them today. He also recalled that in July 2016, while housed in 4H, he occupied one of the two single rooms, likely bed 13, as he was both the clerk of the unit and the chairperson of the ILC at the time. Mr. Moore testified about the events on July 3, 2016. According to Mr. Moore, Officer Carl came to work for the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift. informed Mr. Moore that he wasn't feeling well and instructed Mr. Moore to ensure that no one bothered him that day. After conducting a count, Officer Carl reiterated to others that he wasn't feeling good. Later, while preparing for the afternoon chow, Mr. Moore noticed that Officer Carl was leaning back in his chair with a book on his chest. Mr. Moore testified he went to his room to change his shoes and heard a commotion. Upon returning, he saw a group gathered around Officer Carl, who was bleeding. Mr. Moore testified that when Officer Carl was asked if they should pull the emergency pin, Officer Carl refused. Mr. Moore then instructed others to alert help by banging on the door. Eventually, an incarcerated individual pulled the pin, and officers arrived to assist Officer Carl. Mr. Moore later told Sergeant O'Neill that Officer Carl had fallen from his chair, but apparently Sergeant O'Neill became angry, accusing Mr. Moore of lying. Mr. Moore testified the situation escalated as the unit remained on lockdown, with incarcerated individuals being questioned. Ultimately, according to Mr. Moore, he and others maintained that Officer Carl had fallen from his chair. On the morning of July 6, 2016, Mr. Moore testified he recalled observing a green full-size school bus approaching Building 4 at a high speed. Mr. Moore testified he was concerned, so he quickly ran through the housing unit, waking up incarcerated individuals, urging them to get up and prepare for what he perceived as an impending threat. By the time he reached the back rooms, he was shocked to see everyone running into the day room. He testified that normally during a frisk, a count would be called to keep everyone accounted for, but no count had been called. Mr. Moore testified when he turned around he saw a large number of officers entering the day room. Mr. Moore testified that as officers entered the day room, incarcerated individuals began trying to flee, but there was nowhere to go due to the layout of the housing unit. Mr. Moore observed officers physically assaulting incarcerated individuals, knocking them to the ground, kicking and beating them as the officers moved through the dorm. The assaults continued until officers reached his area. Mr. Moore testified that he witnessed grown men screaming, crying, and asking why they were being hit despite complying by lying on the ground. Mr. Moore could not identify specific individuals being assaulted because the violence was happening to everyone indiscriminately. As officers approached Mr. Moore's room, he testified an officer yelled, "Where's that fucking Johnny Cochran dude at?" referring to Mr. Moore, though he did not know the officers' names and the officers had no name tags. When they reached him, they kicked a mop bucket filled with bleach into his face. The bleach burned his eyes and throat, making it difficult for him to breathe. When he tried to protect his face with his hands, an officer stepped on his right hand, preventing him from moving and wiping the bleach off, while also kicking him in the head and ribs. The officer also opened Mr. Moore's locker, threw his food around the room, damaged his legal documents and Black's Law Dictionary, and cut his headphones and extension cord with a pocket knife.
Keith Gates. Claimant Keith Gates testified that by July 2016, when the incident occurred, he had been at the facility for approximately 8 months. Mr. Gates recalled Officer Call describing him as a young officer who was well-liked and considered one of the best COs there. Before July 3, 2016, Mr. Gates noted that Officer Call was very active, frequently moving around and engaging with everyone. Mr. Gates confirmed that he clearly remembers July 3, 2016, the day Officer Call was injured. Mr. Gates described being in the day room on July 3, 2016, either on or just getting off the phone, when Officer Call entered, stating that he wasn't feeling well and wanted to be left alone. Mr. Gates testified he witnessed Officer Call get up from his chair, appear lightheaded, and fall, hitting his head on a locker. He recalled seeing Officer Call's face just before he fell. Several people ran into the bubble to help, but Officer Call insisted he could manage on his own. Despite this, the pin was pulled, and more officers arrived. Shortly after, a facility count was called. Mr. Gates testified that on the morning of July 6th, while he was in the day room, Ricardo Moore alerted others by saying they were coming, signaling the approaching officers. Mr. Gates stated that while he was in the day room getting ice for his food, the officers entered through the door. Mr. Gates testified how, during the raid, officers instructed everyone to get on the floor, and those who didn't comply were hit. He recalled that he was getting ice when his friend Carl Champagne, who Mr. Gates mentioned was a little slow, did not immediately move when the officers entered. Mr. Champagne was the first to be assaulted as he walked down the hallway, with the officers knocking him to the ground. Mr. Gates recounted the raid on July 6, 2016, describing how he ran down the hallway while officers stormed in, shouting for everyone to get on the floor. Mr. Gates, carrying ice, ran to his room, yelling warnings to others as he went. Once in his room, he recounted how he hid under his bed, terrified by the screams of other incarcerated individuals being assaulted. When officers entered his room, he testified that they kicked him in the hip to get him out from under the bed, forced him to open his locker, and then proceeded to destroy his belongings. One officer smashed his radio and smeared peanut butter on his face. Afterward, Mr. Gates was taken for questioning, where the officer even remarked about the peanut butter on him. Mr. Gates testified that an officer slapped him in the face and struck him several times using 2-foot-long pepperoni sticks from his locker. The officers also destroyed photographs of Mr. Gates's family and pieces of his clothing. Mr. Gates testified that he was not physically injured by the slap with the peanut butter, but he was sore and bruised from being kicked during the incident. He estimated that the soreness lasted about 2 weeks, though he couldn't recall the exact duration. He also mentioned being bruised from the pepperoni stick, but confirmed there were no broken bones. He also testified that he was not seriously injured, experiencing only some bruising and soreness, which resolved in a few weeks. Mark Canada partially corroborated Mr. Gates's account, testifying that he saw Mr. Gates being chased down a hallway and heard him screaming. However, in Mr. Gates' grievance dated August 30, 2016, he mentioned being kicked in the side, punched in the head, and stepped on, with no reference to the pepperoni stick.
If you found value in this video, please share it, like the video, and leave a comment. And if you have not already, please subscribe. Thank you. Take care and God bless.